Today I'm going to tell you a story about Samuel Hawker. Sometimes you find a story before you even realize you're meant to tell it. A woman named Gwen Janet Grundon Coleman reached out to me on Ancestry back in 2020 and said she had some old photographs of my grandma, Clarabelle Merritt, and members of our extended family. And she said her and Grandma Merritt were first cousins. She told me she didn't have any relatives who wanted them, and she hoped they would go to someone who'd appreciate them. When the photos arrived, she had labeled almost every single one by hand. Miss Gwen even grouped them into envelopes with family names on them. All of them were names I recognized, and I bet you will too. The envelopes were labeled Corson, Merritt, Osborne, and France. And one of the pictures in them was a cabinet card, which is a hard kind of a cardboard back photograph from the turn of the century from 1800s into the 1900s. And so that cabinet card had, it was a man seated in a photographer's studio with a little boy on one side and a little girl on the other. I didn't know their names yet, but I would still learn that this photograph captured one of the only moments when Samuel Hawker still had two of his three children beside him. And once I learned his story, it moved me to tears. Actual tears, y'all. So that is what I'm going to tell you about today. Samuel's story begins long before he was born. His parents, Harrison Marion Hawker and Susan Carpenter, were from Wilson County, Tennessee. And like many families in the 1840s, they left Tennessee as the soil wore thin and opportunities dwindled. They followed the normal migration routes north, crossing into Kentucky and the Ohio River, and into the rich farmland of southern Illinois. Land back then was pretty cheap in southern Illinois too. There might have been some economic reasons for their move. By the time they married in 1857, the Hawkers were firmly rooted in Jefferson County, Illinois. They raised their four children there, William, Samuel, Sarah, and Mary. Now, Samuel, his early life was marked with a civil war. When he was around 5, the Great Blizzard of 1864 hit southern Illinois with its deep snow and livestock losses. People and families were isolated for weeks during this snowstorm. It was not a small, little, normal Illinois snowstorm. So around that same time, cholera outbreaks were really popular, or not popular, but they were common in the Midwest. And that was caused by contaminated wells. And once someone got symptoms, they were dead within hours of that. And some entire communities were quarantined because of the cholera outbreak. And there were other common diseases too during his childhood: smallpox, typhoid, Russian flu pandemic, and tuberculosis. Samuel grew up in a world shaped by farming, church gatherings, and the steady rhythm of rural life. In 1870, the census shows him as a young man in Mount Vernon. A couple years later, they had the long winter between 1872 and 1873, during which heavy snow and bitter cold affected that whole entire Midwest. Farmers struggled with frozen wells and crop failures. And by 1880, the family had moved a few miles east to the Field Township, where small family farms were beginning to feel the pressure of shifting markets and falling crop prices. Many Illinois farmers were looking south and west for better land and better prospects during this time. Around that same time, Samuel developed an interest in a local girl named Louisa E. Wilson. Here's a photo of Louisa Wilson from around 1899. She was born on May 14th, 1878 in Jefferson County, Illinois. She was the fifth child of 8 from the family of Samuel Mathis Wilson and his wife, Rebecca Osborne Wilson. Here is a picture of the large Wilson family. In the front row, from left to right, you have beautiful Louisa, the bride-to-be, William, Sarah Jane, who later married a Nance, and Eldora, who later married a Venata, And in the back row, there's Rosa Ann, who later became Yvonne, Isaac, Martha Caroline, who was known as Maddie and later married David Isom Corson, and John Hamilton Wilson. In 1887, a great drought hit southern Illinois. It pushed a lot of farmers to consider leaving the state for greener pastures. On February 22nd, 1899, Samuel married Louisa Wilson. Later that same year, on Samuel's own Halloween birthday, their daughter, Grace Mae, was born. Now, right now, you might be counting the months between February wedding and the birth of Grace Mae in October. Yes, it was 8 months. The 1900 census, taken on June 16th, still places them in Field Township, but soon after, Samuel and Louisa made a life-changing decision. They packed up their young family and moved nearly 700 miles to Celeste in Hunt County, Texas, where Samuel's sister Sarah had moved. Now, Texas was booming at the turn of the century. The railroads were booming, land was cheap, and cotton was king. The state actively recruited farmers from the Midwest, promising fertile soil and a fresh start. Now, Louisa was pregnant during the journey. Their trip from Illinois to Texas in 1899 was almost certainly made by rail. By the late 19th century, long-distance wagon travel had largely disappeared, replaced by an expanding network of the railroad lines that connected the Midwest to the South. Samuel and Louisa would have bordered a local Illinois line, likely traveling through St. Louis before traveling to one of the major southern routes, such as the Missouri Pacific or the International and Great Northern Railroad. These lines carried thousands of Midwestern families into Texas each year, offering affordable fares and a relatively comfortable ride. The entire trip would have taken 2 to 4 days, depending on the connections, and the final leg would have brought them into North Texas and then onto the small farming community of Celeste. It was a long journey, but one filled with hope for better land, better opportunity, and a fresh start. The next year was the year of the 1900 Galveston hurricane. It didn't directly impact them that far inland, except for it resulted in yellow fever and malaria in the area. This storm was also so catastrophic that even in Celeste, which was far east inland, it affected the whole state. So relief trains, refugees, and the economic shockwaves reached North Texas for sure. Their son, Roy Wayne, was born in Texas on March 3rd, 1901. A year later, Louisa became pregnant again, and this is where Samuel's story turns from hope to heartbreak. In 1902, Louisa gave birth to their third child, Ruby Bell, but Louisa died that same year, almost certainly from complications of the childbirth. She was only in her 20s, and then Ruby Bell, the baby, only lived a short time. She died in 1903, still a baby, and they were buried in the Celeste Cemetery. Samuel was now a widower with 2 small children, trying to farm in a new state, far from the family he grew up with. But the losses were not over. In 1907, Samuel's mother, Susan, died back in Illinois. And less than a month later, his son, Roy, just 6.5 years old, also passed away. His body was buried at the Pleasant Hill Cemetery in Illinois. We can't be sure if he was visiting his grandparents when he died or if his father shipped his tiny body back to them for burial. By the end of 1907, Samuel had lost his wife, 2 of his 3 children, and his mother. Only he and little Grace remained. And in 1908, there was the North Texas tornado outbreak, which they survived, thank goodness. In the 1910 census, Samuel and Grace are living with his sister Sarah Tate, and her husband Celeste. Samuel worked as a farmer, doing what he had always done, working the land, surviving the seasons, and raising his daughter the best he could. But then tragedy struck again when Sarah died in 1911 at only 47 years old. Grace grew up and married Charlie F. Scott in 1918 during a great drought that collapsed cotton yields. Many farmers were already struggling already financially when the Spanish flu pandemic hit and shut down entire towns. Schools closed and churches. Our modern day comparison is COVID-19. It was just as widespread, catastrophic. It collapsed the world for a while, just like it did ours. So Grace began a family of her own. She gave Samuel 3 granddaughters, Ollie Louise, Bernice, and Edith Pauline. In 1920, Samuel was living with Grace and Charlie, his daughter, and her husband, helping on the farm and watching his granddaughters grow. In the 1930 census, he's still living with them in the household with a young man named Fred Scott, which was Charlie's younger brother. And this kind of reminds us how extended families pulled together during the difficult years leading into the Great Depression. Also, during that time, from 1930 to 36, North Texas was having a respiratory crisis from the dust storms. Although they were not directly in the path of the Dust Bowl storms, it spawned off smaller Dust Bowl storms, and that respiratory crisis caused chronic coughing, pneumonia, and worsening heart conditions, especially in older adults like Samuel. On December 15th, 1938, a couple weeks before Christmas, Samuel died of bronchial pneumonia, with hypertension as a contributing factor. His daughter Grace was the informant on his death certificate, the same little girl who once stood beside him in that cabinet photograph. He was buried in Celeste Cemetery and shares a tombstone with his wife Louisa and his daughter Ruby Bell. Samuel never remarried. Samuel, I hope you rest in peace and are surrounded by your family in heaven again. I'm Melissa, the amateur historian who loves to bring you these family histories. If you like these videos, please be sure to hit the bell below to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Stories Beyond the Dash. I started this channel almost a week ago, and every like, view, and share means a whole lot to me and inspires me to create more content. If you'd like me to focus on a video on your ancestor, please let me know in the comments below. And thank you so much for watching.